Politics is quite divisive and the nature of it swings one way or another. I do have some viewers who don't like my opinions. They seem to watch my content for punishment, but mostly people want to watch opinions that chime largely with their own. So you have to decide, are you just going to present information, pure information with no perspective, or are you going to present opinion? Politics is ultimately about trying to persuade people who think very differently to vote for you.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everybody. It is another episode here. My name's Piotr, and this time we're talking about the UK. We're talking about Brexit. We're talking about the state of British politics and sort of its place in Europe and transatlantic relations and the world, I suppose. Global Britain, perhaps. Joining me this time around is Phil Moorhouse. He is I think, pretty entertaining creator on YouTube who does a lot of things to do with the UK, but not just from a sort of silly perspective or something. He's got some truly interesting insights and I think takes some pretty boring issues and makes them very, very interesting and engaging. And I encourage you to check out the creator behind the content, as we're going to be talking about in this part one. So, Phil, thanks very much for joining. My favorite question, really, to start off with is really a little bit about yourself and what got you started in your YouTube journey.
So, I mean, very briefly, I've been very interested in politics from an incredibly young age. I grew up in fairly politically turbulent times, not as turbulent as these days. And I was always very interested. And I would discuss politics with lots of people, but not so much on the internet. What started me off doing content on the internet actually was a gaming channel on YouTube. And then when I stopped doing that, I decided I quite liked doing YouTube content. I was working as a science and maths teacher at the time. So I thought to myself, well, what does everyone want to do on YouTube? You want to blog about something, and what do I always want to talk about, which is politics. So I started doing political content towards the end of 2018. I started the channel earlier in 2018, but I didn't really know what I was doing with it. So, and then it sort of took off. I guessed it would. I'd already had experience on YouTube, so I knew many of the basics of starting a YouTube channel and growing a YouTube channel. And I knew that politics was going to be particularly crazy over the next few years, as it has turned out to be. So eventually then moved from teaching full-time to, political commentary full-time, really.
I see. So you've got an experience with taking complex issues, if you like, and making them more accessible or relatable or entertaining, perhaps, for larger, wider audiences.
I have a professional interest, yes, in trying to explain things to people, wanting to actually explain things to people, yes.
And I guess you mentioned that one of your videos I was watching yesterday was about the fact that March 29th is the anniversary for when we initiated Article 50. Do you try to bring in a little bit of historical context into your videos, or it's more focused on the current events and just focusing on the here and now sort of thing? You prefer to do a mixture?
It mostly focuses on the here and now, unless you want to talk about some sort of trajectory. Sometimes you have to look at where you've come from to see where you're eventually going to be going. But I don't like to dwell too much on the past, particularly when it comes to Brexit. There are some people who are accused of trying to refight old battles. So I look at it as, we're out of the EU now. If we are to join it, we use the word rejoin. I use the word rejoin. It would be better to just describe it as join, because we have never gone through the process of joining. It would be completely new, because we were not a founder member of the original project as it was decades ago, but we were a founding member of the EU when that was set up. So we never had to go through that process. It would be very new to people. So, yeah, I try to talk about the here and now. I don't complain too much these days about what led us to, what I think is a very poor decision, because you can learn from it from a campaigning point of view. It doesn't help. We just need to focus on where we are and what direction would be the best to take us in.
No, I understand that. I think for me, being in that earlier phases of launching a current affairs, geopolitical, macro focused channel, it's an interesting journey, having that sort of hope that it will go somewhere or sort of unpredictability of it. I guess politics is not exactly something that you can fully plan for unless you're focusing on the longer scale where you can just talk about videos over a longer time. But if it's more on the here and now as you're doing it, it can be quite... do you find that is the case running a political channel, that it's quite sometimes difficult knowing how to prepare content, what to focus on, what not to focus on, or you sort of just flow with it?
Yes, it is very difficult. And you have to adapt very quickly. If you were doing a cooking channel, you could do a whole week of cooking and you might have 3 weeks worth of content, give yourself 2 weeks off or something like that. You can plan a long time in advance. With politics, there are times, very few times, thankfully, but there are times when I've had to cancel a video because a video has come out and then suddenly news has broken literally 5 minutes before it's due to be published. And it's like, okay, that's old now. And sometimes I steer clear of certain topics because on a particular day, because I know there's a good chance there will be some breaking news that can change it. So you have to, on a daily basis, I have to review, and most of the content I do is actually recorded on the same day because something may well change indeed.
Yeah, no, for sure. And some of these things, you alluded to your perspective on Brexit and we're going to unpack that in part 2. So I encourage people to keep a lookout for that. But take me through your growth a little bit. Like, take me through your journey of consistently going through and pushing through. Because for me, it can be a slog. You said you've got experience, but I think a lot of people who don't run these sorts of things don't fully appreciate the anxiety-inducing aspect of YouTube. Maybe I'm overdoing it, but for me, it's certainly that nagging obsession in the back of your mind when you post a video. And they're like, oh, is the thumbnail right? Or I don't know if the title's right. Maybe because you've reached that point where you're big now and established, but for younger sort of creators, it's still a worry. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I still have things to learn. There are still things I learn. There are still things I change. I'm changing something right now. But over years, like a lot of people when they start YouTube, they have their content and they can be very good at presenting it, or they're very knowledgeable about something and they just put videos out, and that sometimes works and it sometimes works very well. And sometimes it works very poorly because there is also a skill to, winning on YouTube, so to speak. And there are examples of good practice that some people can become successful on YouTube without ever really realizing. But if you do, it does help you to grow. And there are some aspects of good practice that I'm aware of that I don't do myself. So I know that I'm not the best I can be. And sometimes I address those things and sometimes I don't. But because what I'd done over the years when I was doing a completely different channel, because I was interested in YouTube, and I never wanted that channel to build up, by the way, that was always a hobby channel for me. It was never intended to become large, but I was still interested in, so let's say I wanted that, or if I wanted to do a different channel, because I had thought about doing a different channel, but at the time it would have been a more science-based channel rather than politics. And so I still learned, and I followed successful content creators who had something to say, and I would talk to people. I talk to people who advise large corporations on marketing strategies, because there's a lot of common ground no matter how you try to market yourself, whether it's by building a YouTube channel or launching an advertising campaign. There are a lot of common features to it. So I was quite interested in that side of it, so that when I decided at the end of 2018 to turn what was a random blogging channel into a regular political commentary channel, I knew a lot of the basics. I knew what I had to build up, and I was able to plan for that. But also, I pay very careful attention to my analytics. I look at the data and I react to it. I don't wait. I've seen too many YouTubers who've been successful and then they've sort of allowed their channel to sort of dwindle away. So whenever I see, and it has happened a few times, for example, COVID, I became a full-time YouTuber just as COVID was happening, and that threw things completely out, and I had to adapt to that very quickly. That was quite stressful. And then the same thing happened
with, like, what? What about COVID made you adapt
with
so much?
YouTube? Yeah. So with you, all of a sudden, Brexit, which was my main thing, but Westminster politics in general, was no longer a big issue. We had a huge, international emergency, but in terms of British politics, a national emergency. So all of a sudden, you were discussing that because that was going to impact everyone's lives, except for the fact that my audience was not built up on an interest in infectious diseases or anything. And also, YouTube were demonetizing a lot of COVID content.
Yes.
Now, they did eventually change that. But what it meant was when you're now a full-time YouTuber and reliant upon it for your income, and because that's what's generating the interest. So at that point, I did have to do videos well in advance because I had to be very careful about what I said. I had to be very careful about the way it was being packaged. And I would have to upload it to be published well in advance so that when the algorithm said, oh no, there's something wrong with this, I could request a manual review, and almost all of those were cleared. So I was following the guidelines. It was all absolutely fine. But the initial algorithm would say no. And on YouTube, you get sometimes you get a video that goes viral and it'll run and run. But almost every video, you get its views in the first 24 hours. You get then another little chunk after the next 24 hours. After that, it's nothing. It goes down to nothing. So you can have videos that will get 50,000 views, but on the third day, it'll get like 500. So if you have it demonetized and it takes a day to be reviewed and cleared, you've lost the revenue, even though it's cleared at that point, because it was demonetized up until then. So I had to do them a day or two in advance, which was extra tricky with fast-moving politics, and just had to be quite clever about the way I was packing it to try and avoid problems with the algorithm. But when it had them, because I published it in advance, there was time for it to be cleared before it was published. But, YouTube did adapt to that. They are actually quite good. They adapted to the changing situation. And after that, that was fine. But it was just that initial period where it was like, oh dear, I'm now doing this full time. This is my full-time income. And I'm having to talk about, because the major political issue went from being Brexit in February 2020 to March 2020, it was becoming COVID, and into April. And it was like, okay, so not only do I have to almost like build, because the thing on YouTube is you're targeting a particular type of viewer who's interested in a particular type of thing. And if you change that thing, all of a sudden they may not be interested. But I was having to. So I was forced to, because although Brexit was still happening over that year, COVID was. And it wasn't just a health issue, it was a political issue, because political decisions were being made. And some of them were very poor political decisions. So there was a lot of, and that was the main political discussion to have. So I had to segue into that. That was hugely challenging.
The state of YouTube as it is now, as it's changed with the introductions of shorts and just counterbalancing against other, platforms that have really sort of potentially threatened YouTube's model. You think that it's doing well? You think that you've seen an improvement in your time on YouTube, or you think there's a regression?
Oh, yes. I have my gripes with YouTube now and then, as anyone would with anything, but they are very good and they're very proactive, and they, listen to creators, and they do make changes. When the whole adpocalypse started, when I was doing my other channel, which was, for those who don't know, there were accusations that adverts were for major brands were appearing on content that was highly unsuitable. And because YouTube is a threat to other media outlets, particularly in Britain and America, there were a lot of attacks on YouTube, and they were urging major sponsors like Coca-Cola and Pepsi to withdraw from them, which they sort of did. So YouTube had to adapt to that. So that is why YouTube as a social media platform is now very good, and it's very safe. It's nowhere near as toxic as many other social media platforms, because they had to take action against that. So their automatic systems are improving all the time. So yeah, I find it an incredibly useful social media platform to use.
I think it's fantastic.
Aside from the fact it's an obvious place to generate revenue.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that they've really nailed down the model, and I've been very active on X Twitter before. Well, it was X Twitter, and Musk tried to do that whole ad revenue sharing thing, but it's peanuts. And the general, I think, political climate on that platform has severely degraded. Not even if you don't necessarily agree with the views, but the ability to have genuine intellectual discourse or just be decent is disappeared, evaporated, and I find YouTube a much more welcoming space. And it's nice to be able to, speak to fellow creators like yourself in these sorts of environments. But where do you feel you want to take the channel? Your content is reflective of how British politics evolves. We've got a British election coming up. Do you have a plan for what you want to do? Or you're just sort of taking it a day, a week at a time?
So I do always think in advance. Inevitably, like a lot of particularly political content, as I say, completely different to you compared to a cooking channel, which brings everyone in who likes to watch cooking. Politics is quite divisive, and the nature of it swings one way or another. So at the moment, what I'm effectively discussing, although that's not my intention, but what I'm effectively discussing is counter to the current authority. Whereas, because I'm a Labour supporter, so if Labour then form a strong government, I'm much more likely to be more positive about the government. And some viewers may go, well, I don't like either party. So you were talking negatively about the government at this point. I agreed with you. Now you're talking positively about the government, but I don't like that government either. So there will be adaptations required. I've had to adapt multiple times. I mean, I mentioned COVID. The other big thing that shook things up for my channel was the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, because at the time, I actually had more viewers outside the UK than from the UK watching my content. All of a sudden, UK politics is still very, very important to UK viewers. But to people outside of the UK, particularly in Europe, all of a sudden, hang on, we're being invaded. That's now more important than what you're doing. So now the majority of my viewers are from the UK.
Interesting.
So again, there was adaptation there because I had to be mindful that my audience was changing. And to be successful on YouTube or any social media platform, you have to have that idea of your typical viewer very much in mind. And so if it naturally changes because of events, you have to change with it. And the same thing will happen, when the government changes. I will just have to adapt to that. Whether I'll do so successfully depends. I have various things I think about in advance. If this happens, this is what I could do. How I will do it will be reactive. I'm not going to change something that's working on the assumption that tomorrow it's not going to. But I have things so that I don't do a knee-jerk reaction, I have things that I think about changing. Should I need to?
Yeah, it's, you mentioned about the potential of alienation of viewers because you change your framing from negative to positive. Do you find that it can be initially hard to find your audience as such? And I'll clarify that with an additional point, which is that do you find that people who try to engage every side can sometimes ultimately lose out? Like if you try to take a more objective approach instead of just being quite clearly positioned in your perspectives, that works against you because ultimately people are like, well, you don't stand for anything and therefore we don't, or you disagree with that premise?
It very much depends on what your pitch is. If you are trying to just present objective facts or news without much of a perspective, that's absolutely fine. So, for example, TLDR News are just trying to present the facts of the matter. So they can appeal to all sides, and that's not a problem. If you are going to present opinion, you have to accept that people who don't, I do have some viewers who don't like my opinions. They seem to watch my content for punishment. But mostly people want to watch opinions that chime largely with their own. You'll never chime completely. I have plenty of comments that say, I normally agree with you, but you've got this wrong or that wrong. And, and that will happen because no two people are going to agree on everything. But you have to be aware that the vast majority, if you're going to present opinion, the vast majority of people who will want to watch you are people who will broadly at least agree with those opinions. And the people who are very much polar opposite on those opinions are really not going to enjoy listening to you at all. And you just have to accept that. So you have to decide, are you just going to present information, pure information with no perspective, or are you going to present opinion?
Yeah, it's that weird balancing act if you think you can try to take a little bit of both. But I think there's some people I've noticed who want to try and do that whole Jeremy Paxman or be an interviewer who interviews people from many different sides and sort of tries to get the crux of why they think like they do, sort of Lex Friedman maybe types. But that doesn't seem to resonate with many people, at least unless it's a really established name already. And if you're trying to sort of start out by doing that, it doesn't always hit the ground in the way that you think it would.
So I was just going to say, there are some things on YouTube that are quite difficult. Some people try to do it in the same way as you would established media like television media. And they fail to take account of the fact that if someone sits down to watch a television program, even if it's for the first time, they'll give it a decent go. They'll get, on YouTube, they won't. Even if they click on your thumbnail, they'll give you like 7 seconds. They'll click straight off. It's so easy to click off on YouTube, and people are used to doing that. So they will give you no time at all. So people do need to be mindful of that as well. So you can't just do something in the way that you can't mimic what you've seen on a television program. People give more. They've sat down to watch a television program. They'll give it a few minutes at least. They won't do that on YouTube. And the other thing as well is just, again, it's thinking about that target audience. What are they interested in? You might do a sports channel and you might be really interested in football and cricket. Now, and you do football content and you might want to do cricket content as well. You think that will grow your audience because you'll be attracting football and cricket fans. You won't. You'll shrink your audience because the only audience that will be interested are the ones who are interested in football and cricket. Because the YouTube algorithm cannot help you. You do a video on football and it's well received and people like it. And when you do your next video on cricket, it shows it to the people who liked the last video, but the last video was on football. YouTube helps. It wants to get your content to people who want to watch it. So that's why you have to have a very fixed idea of who your target audience member is, because YouTube is trying to work out what sort of viewer enjoys your content. So your content has to be consistently approved of by that type of viewer. And if you try to open your net too much, you end up shrinking it.
That's a good point. Yeah. And I guess my last question for you really, Phil, is what's your initial plan? If you had one particular thing you wanted to leave viewers with for our sort of dive into the creator behind the content, in this case yourself, what would it be?
In terms of what I'm aiming to do on YouTube?
Yeah, well, I don't know. Just how would you summarize yourself on YouTube? I don't know if you had to pick 3 words or one.
So it's mostly to make politics accessible because it takes a lot of time. You have to spend a lot of time. Politics is ultimately about trying to persuade people who think very differently to vote for you. That's what politicians need to happen. They need people who are all very different, from very different backgrounds, from very different perspectives, to vote for them. And as a result, politicians, or the good politicians, learn to say things that will appeal to these people with not polar opposite views, because that's impossible, but very different views.
Yeah.
So what do politicians actually mean? And that's where I come in. So what does this mean? In reality, because you need to spend a lot of time paying attention to politicians, exactly what they say. You don't just listen to one speech. It's like that speech. And then a couple of weeks ago, they presented this other speech on the same thing, but to a different audience. So what were the common themes within it? And what do they intend to do? And all of this takes a great deal of time, more time than people with a more casual interest in politics have got. So I try to sort of break it down and explain to people what the reality of a political situation is, or what the reality of what a politician is trying to say or do is.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Phil. It's been very interesting to learn about yourself and the channel a bit more. I hope people enjoyed the conversation. And if you did, be sure to check out Phil's channel as well, if you haven't already. Yeah, I look forward to having you back on for part 2. And everyone, see you all next time. But till then, ta-ra.
this isn't a brain, and decided that it passed as feasible dialogue, so this probably isn't too much of a stretch. Anyways, into Kellogg's brain. Of course, they